Awesome. Well, welcome everybody to today's series of our leadership series sessions that we have. It's May 12th, 2021, already into May. I'm Allison Daly, founder and CEO of Recruiting Innovation. We are on a mission to elevate the tech recruiting industry from being seen as a necessary evil to being valued as a true talent partner. One key element of our business is our Ernestine McClendon Talent Grant that we run as a 5-month cohort twice a year to help attract, train, and certify talent from underrepresented communities to be awesome certified tech recruiters. So the industry needs you. And we all need more perspectives and more experience on our teams from different walks of life. And so part of our talent grant is we have a monthly leadership series where we get to hear from awesome specialists from every stripe of the talent industry, and we get to hear about their career, kind of what they're working on now, and things that they wish they'd maybe known earlier in their career, or that they wish that this group of certified recruiters would know as they go off into the world. And so today's guest, which I'm so excited about, is Nina Baliga. She's here in Denver. We have known each other for quite some years at this point, and you have an amazing story as well. I can't wait to hear more. But Nina is now VP of Customer Success and Inclusion at InterviewIA. And InterviewIA just closed a major round of funding. So I'm really excited as we come out of this COVID slump to see some of my favorite local companies that are doing the work and making a difference in the talent industry in different ways, getting funding. So like this is also a strong indicator of where the market is, where it's going. But we'll talk about that a little bit later once we get into some more that you have to share. Enough about this. Nina, welcome so much. Welcome to our conversation. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be joining you all today. I hope that the story I share will resonate with folks, and hopefully you'll learn a couple things out of this that you can take back to your careers as a recruiters.
Oh gosh, I am going to. We froze up.
I froze up.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, let's try that again. I'm so sorry, everybody. That was probably on my end.
Yeah, I could hear you, and then you froze for a little bit.
Okay, well, I'm like closing all the browsers, my internet. That's just like the theme in the last year is like freezing and I'm on mute. So please, what were you saying before I froze the call?
Well, I can start off with a little bit of my history.
Yes, please.
Okay. So, I think with a lot of people in the HR recruiting space, there's a lot of different ways you can get there. And I have to say that my career trajectory, 20 years ago, I never would have thought I'd be doing what I am today. I actually started my career in the nonprofit sector. I was doing largely social justice work, working with communities of color. I worked for a labor union for a little bit, helping try and get a living wage for the janitors that were working in these high-rise, multi-million-dollar condos in South Florida and Miami, largely from immigrant communities from Cuba and Haiti. I did work with Asian American Pacific Islander communities across the US. And after 10 years of a nonprofit sector, I burned out and I pivoted into tech, and I taught myself front-end web development and user experience design, because I really had a passion for recognizing how tech can be a tool for building community and building communication, and really it's an opportunity for social change in its own way. But I just wanted to learn the technical parts of it. So I started doing that and was building websites and building apps and designing that. Worked for a couple of digital marketing agencies and was really enjoying my career in tech. when I moved to Colorado 5 years ago. So I was in the DC area for a very long time before I moved to Colorado 5 years ago. I found the Colorado climate and the mountains and everything so beautiful. So I was just really fell in love with the place, and I came here. And I think one of the things I didn't realize would hurt me so much was the real lack of diversity in Colorado. Very homogenous, very white space. And when I came here, I started networking because I was doing freelance UX and dev work. And as I was networking at all these different tech meetups, there's something I always noticed, and that I was the only woman of color in the room at pretty much every single meetup I went to. And so generally at these meetups, there would be panelists on stage or speakers on stage, and it was always a white man or multiple white men. They were always talking about technology and its impact, but never really catching the gaps on the way that technology can both positively and negatively impact marginalized communities. Oftentimes during these meetups, I would raise my hand. I'm pretty vocal, and I would say, "Hey, had you thought about this?" I'll just give an example. One time, I was at a Boulder design meetup where they were talking about data-driven decisions. So it was two white men on stage who were talking about their tech companies and how they use all of the data of their current users to figure out what they need to design and build for their tech products moving forward. And one of the things I told them was that, a large part of your user base, based on the way you're marketing and talking about your stuff, is white men. White men only make up 25% of the population of this country. What are you doing about the 75% that you're making your decisions on the 25% and you're missing out on 75% of the market? What are you doing about that? Their answer was, well, there's not really a solution for that, so we're just going to do what we do. And then pretty much ignored me, and not a single person approached me afterwards in that meetup. And it was a very lonely, isolating feeling, but it was also a real clear need to be addressing this disparities. And it's not just because it's the right thing to do or we need more diversity for the sake of it, but it was so obvious to me that there was just so many products and companies that were just missing out on opportunities to really build something special and something different and have a much bigger impact. It didn't matter if there was a social driven component to your product. What's important is that you are making sure your product gets into the hands of as many people as possible. And if you're only designing it for white men, and if you're only being designed by white men, then you're really going to miss out. So I, after just being ignored over and over again at these meetups, I got really depressed, and got really angry, and I kind of started isolating myself. But oftentimes when I get really depressed and angry, it turns into me just taking action. So I went on a mission to go and find all the women of color in tech in Colorado. And I started reaching out in all the Slack forums and trying to find other people who were in tech and were women of color. Didn't matter if they were developers, engineers, recruiters, just people who were in this space. And what I ended up learning about was a hackathon that was sponsored by the Secretary of State here in Colorado called Go Code Colorado. And they had a lot of intentionality around diversity and having a really diverse group of people participating in this hackathon. It wasn't just geographical diversity, but was really thinking about how do we get more women into joining this hackathon. And I met two of the organizers. One was a woman of color, and I saw how passionate they were about making this change. And when I met those organizers, I was like, okay, I will show up to this hackathon. So I showed up, and I ended up meeting a team of women who were all there, and we were just talking. We formed a group, we were talking, and not surprisingly, all of us were really frustrated by the lack of diversity in tech. And so over the course of a weekend, we actually built an app that would help hiring managers find tech talent from underrepresented groups in Colorado's colleges and universities. And we built the app, we launched it on both the Apple App Store and Android Store. And then we pitched it at this competition. None of us were really there to start a company. We were there to meet people and build something fun for the weekend. But what we built really resonated with the judges. And I think it resonated with a lot of people. So we became one of the 10 finalists. And I was on the stage of the Denver Performing Arts Center pitching this business idea to help bring more diversity into tech. And while we didn't win the competition, a lot of people came up to us afterwards. And these were like in front of like Colorado's top technologists. And they were like, we love what you're doing. We want to see where you go with this. Like, please keep in touch. So me and one other woman on the team decided we'd give it a shot. And we launched our startup called Diversity. And what we ended up building was a place, it was kind of like the Glassdoor for inclusion, where companies who really valued inclusion could create profiles highlighting what they're doing around that. And then tech talent from underrepresented groups could find and find those job opportunities with those companies and connect with them. In the process of building the startup, I was talking to a lot of companies, especially around like the HR folks, the folks who were in charge of hiring, a lot of directors of engineering and CTOs who were trying to figure out how can I build a more diverse workforce, and then really learning a lot about their pain points. And in the process of doing that, it just was like a really eye-opening experience because it is a complex problem. As much as, diversity, equity, and inclusion is a buzzword that's thrown around a lot, there's a lot of layers to solving that problem. And I think a lot of times the entryway for companies is through this conversation happens with the recruiters themselves and the recruitment strategies. But it's more complex than that. And I'll go into that in a little bit. So we launched the startup, and actually that soon led to, after a couple of years of that actually led to the launch of a podcast, because I was talking to two other people who are really involved in the HR space. One is the executive director of the Blind Institute of Technology, Mike Hess. And then the other person was a co-founder of a startup called Jobber Group. And all three of us were working in diversity, equity, and inclusion in different angles. And so the three of us got together, we're having a beer, and we were just joking about the fact that we're all talking to companies, they're all talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but they're all kind of missing the point about how to really implement it. So we were kind of sharing war stories, and in the process of doing that, we joked around and we said, well, wouldn't it be funny if we started a podcast? The tagline would be, what would happen if a blind man, a woman of color, and a wannabe Latino get together to talk about how businesses can create more diversity and inclusion in their companies? And so that was the launch of the Choose Inclusion podcast. And we launched that in the fall of 2019. We've had over 100 episodes now. We've had guests from all different walks of life come onto the podcast and share their stories about how they're going about tackling the diversity, equity, and inclusion question at their companies and what kinds of strategies and tactics they've been implementing. So that's a little bit about my background. Allison, do you have any questions before where do you want me to go next?
No, I mean, this is a good, like the preset and then the middle, and then, yeah. So I think it's really cool that, I mean, I hear this often from, especially people of color that have made their way into tech, that tends to be a second choice career. Like you do something else and then you move into tech. And then it's like the journey of like, wow, I used to be somewhere where I fit in and I liked things. And now I am like lonely and lonely, feel like a fish out of water. I have to work hard to find my people, but then use that experience to then like create something that then is valuable to the organization or like, the industry in general. So I think that's really awesome that it's so easy to just sort of shut down when depressed. And that is super understandable. And that you then took this opportunity to go to Go Code Colorado, and then you started to find your flock basically. So I just want to commend you for just the journey. You didn't give up and you kept trying and kept learning and growing. And how would you say, I mean, so it's been quite some time since you moved to Colorado. Like, how are you feeling that things are in the Denver sort of Boulder tech scene now compared to 5 years ago?
I think things have improved pretty dramatically, honestly. It's obviously nowhere where it needs to be, but I think that it's been pretty impressive to see how companies have been spending more time and resources on this. to start changing what that looks like. And like, I could honestly say 5 years ago, when I was talking, like if you even use the words like diversity, equity, and inclusion, belonging, like it was a foreign language that people never even heard those terms before. And now I feel like it's becoming part of the rhetoric. That doesn't necessarily mean that people really understand it, but it starts with the language becoming familiar, and then you can dive deeper into that and start building a complex understanding of the nuances of it. But honestly, like those were words that were pretty foreign, and it was almost to the point where people didn't even understand why they existed. And
Like,
so
what do you mean there's a problem? I've never seen it, said
right,
white person, right? Yeah.
And I think like 2020 was a pretty big game changer too. I think with the Black Lives Matter movement, that really started changing people's perceptions about the inequities in this world and the complexity of the inequities. And I think there was also a really strong push by a lot of people to figure out, you know, what can I do to do this? Because I think everyone wanted to feel like they could do something to change that. And so I think a lot of companies started taking that as like a personal, what can we do? And I think that started kicking off more initiatives, or at least more conversations internally about these larger societal questions around inequities and what does that mean for the workplace? What does that mean for the individuals in the workplace? And like, how does that impact people on a daily basis? And I think that's really matured the conversation in a lot of ways. I think where companies are still struggling, though, is going from conversation to action. And I was talking about this with a colleague of mine early today about, you know, what does DEI mean for InterviewIA? So just to wrap up the professional journey, basically, I ended up sunsetting the startup I created with my co-founder, Kim. And one of my board members from my startup was creating InterviewIA. And, you know, I, having just kind of built an HR tech SaaS company and seeing where InterviewIA was going, I was totally on board with the mission. Basically, what InterviewIA does is it's changing how companies do hiring and interviewing by creating a data-driven, equitable interviewing process. We're removing and mitigating bias by really thinking about what are the things that matter when you're interviewing talent. So it's less about magic numbers like 4 years experience or what college you went to, or did you work at a Google or Amazon, because that stuff doesn't matter. What really matters is like, do you have the skills to be able to do this job? Are you aligned with the team and how the team approaches problem solving and that team culture? And then finally, growth. What are the growth opportunities that you have are looking for? And how does that work in conjunction with the opportunities that the company is looking to help build and help you grow with? And with those three intents, that's how we've been designing our interviews, and we've created a platform to help do that. And I truly believe that what we're doing is by changing how hiring and interviewing is done, we're going to start creating a more equitable workforce. This was the way that I feel like companies, this is just one example of how companies can go from the talk and rhetoric to taking action. What I want to see happen is that it's not just about saying we care about diversity, but what are the systems and processes that you are implementing to create a more equitable and diverse and inclusive workforce? So with InterviewIA, we're actually focusing really deeply on the equity piece. It's really about recognizing that if we keep on going at historical measures of success, which are inherently biased and inherently kind of racist and you know, inherently marginalizing for specific communities, and we start going off of very specific types of skills, transferable skills, you know, there's no reason a bartender couldn't be a really good tech rep, you know, or a tech help desk rep. Do they have the skills to be able to like listen to people, understand their problems, you know, help them come up with solutions? They can get trained on software, they can get trained on the tools, but like the questions you're really looking for, when you start thinking about it a little bit more deeply, you'll start finding that there's a lot of transferable skills. And I think that's how we're really going to start building more diversity in the industry, is by rethinking through how we go about hiring.
Big time. Yeah. I'm like, right now I'm banging the drum on like, what does 21st century recruitment look like? Like, After COVID, we are literally in a different world, thankfully, honestly. I mean, things need to crumble in order for new things to be built up and take their place. And like when we look at, I mean, we can just look at all of society. I mean, in American history, it's predicated on, the genocide of the indigenous people and the enslavement of African people, and all of the resources extracted up to serve the rich white class. And everything's by design by that. And that's not even just like an opinion, it's just the history of things. And so then when we kind of are waking up now, right? 21st century life, democratization of data, the ability to build networks independently of these institutions, right? Things are upside down in a good way. And I think that as we take the wool off our eyes and are like starting to actually self-critically look around at maybe our personal relationships, our professional relationships, where we shop, how we shop, things like that, the mundane is now like being, seen with fresh eyes. And then when we think about recruiting and talent, especially in tech, you look at the data, it is 74%, like the big tech firms, 74% white, 80% male, and then the median age is 27. So 70% of tech is 27-year-old white guys. And that's not by accident. It is by design. It is systems built by certain folks for certain folks to perpetuate that. And it's just, now is the time to critically think about all the things that we take for granted. Like even the idea of, without critically thinking, saying this engineer needs to have 7 years of experience. And you take into consideration, there are entire groups of people that are denied the opportunity for 1 to 3 years of experience. And without thinking you're going to require 7 years of experience, that's convenient, you're just perpetuating this thing without thinking about it. And I 100% believe the future of recruiting, 21st century recruitment and talent, is about outcomes. I love the concept of outcomes-based hiring. It's about skills. It's about transferable skills. It's about moving away from requiring a Stanford CS degree and being like, hey, we're open to a 35-year-old boot camp grad that is like pivoting their career and can add value right away. And so I love that you all are thinking about that. Can you talk to us a little bit more about InterviewIA? Like, how are you, I understand what you're like, big picture. How do you do that within tech? How are you removing bias from the interview process?
Yeah, so I think and this is what's the real value about recruiters too, and where the recruiters can really have an impact. One is recognizing that all of us have bias. Humans are still involved in the interview process. We're never going to be able to completely get rid of bias, but what we can do is figure out ways to mitigate it. And so when we're talking about recruiters going back to the hiring managers and talking to the teams, there's an educational component that recruiters can take on to start talking about, where does our bias come from? How does it come from? And then how can we check ourselves and catch ourselves when bias is coming in? So there's kind of like the systems you can create. Like InterviewIA is really about a way to help you create the systems to rethink how and what you're measuring. What does it really matter that you're measuring? Is it that 7 years? No. And especially in tech, like there are amazing engineers who've like only been doing it for a year. And then there are really mediocre engineers who've been doing it for 7 years. And so when you start thinking about what are the things that you're actually looking for, then you're able to start bringing more diversity into it. But part of it is like building a system. And so InterviewIA helps with that. But as recruiters, I think there's a huge training and education component that you can do. You can go back to your teams and really start saying, like, here's some information about how biases play out in interviews. This is some biases that just work in your day-to-day life. And so when you start having them check that stuff internally, it's also a way to start kind of changing and moving the needle on the diversity piece as well. But there's an intentionality behind it, and it requires a little bit more work. I mean, recruiters, we all have a lot of work on our plates anyway, but sometimes it's a little bit of extra work can have a really big impact too.
And that's a good point. I think what you're just sharing too, in terms of like, even just providing some scenarios on this is how bias shows up, because I'm sure there's some people out there that wouldn't know a microaggression if it bit them in the leg, right? Like they just, I had no idea. And so that's interesting that there's like an educational component, but then there's also like a processes component. You can't have one without the other.
It's really important. And I think that once you start implementing it, and this is one of those things, because a lot of places want to see the data prove out, right? And they don't want to implement something until they already know it's working. It's a chicken and the egg thing. But when you start socializing these concepts, when you start talking about it more, when you start bringing it up regularly in meetings about like how we need to do this, how this is just an imperative as opposed to nice to have, then you start getting that buy-in, because people just start getting used to hearing that language over and over again. And they start getting used to hearing these concepts of like, yes, we have to change our systems. We also have to change our mindset. And when you do that combination, we can really start making that change. And sometimes it'll happen without people even realizing that that's what you're doing when you just start bringing it up all the time.
So what are you finding that has been successful for some of the recruiters that are, taking the mantle of doing a little bit of the education while also just implementing the processes? What are you seeing is working from the recruiter's perspective in the change that you're bringing about?
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the things, and I think this is the one that when most people think about diversity in hiring, they think about sourcing. And that's typically where the conversation ends, but that really is the most powerful place a recruiter can play right now, is really thinking deeply about where are you sourcing your candidates, and really thinking through how you can build relationships with these communities, because that's also a long-term play. As much as, we like to think that if we just go and advertise, at this, women tech event once, and then we'll all of a sudden have this great candidate pool. It's long-term relationship building. I mean, I think recruiters know that everything's about long-term relationship building. But it really is. It's like when you're going out and you're building relationships with this LGBTQ tech groups and the women in tech groups and Black tech groups, and they see that you're an active presence, and they see that you're invested in helping them, whether it's like giving them resources to run the group, or giving them access to internships, or giving them access to trainings, or content that's really valuable for them. That relationship building plays out, because once you have a pool of folks from marginalized identities who start interacting with your company, and because you started really thinking through how do we build these systemic processes, they have great experiences going through your interview process. And really what you want is for every single person going through your interview experience to be like, wow, that was an amazing interview experience. Like, even if I didn't get the job, I'm going to recommend that to my community. I'm going to recommend that to my friend. We all, and that's how you start kind of building and escalating. And then, over years, you start seeing like a massive payback. Because then all of a sudden you have a huge pool of people from these marginalized identities applying for your job, because you've already built a reputation around that. But it starts with just going out into these communities and really trying to build those relationships.
And you're bringing up a good thing, that it's a long-term play. It's not sponsoring it once and going and then giving out your business cards. Like, everyone does that. And in 2021, words are like 8% of what anyone's believing. Like, we're now at the point where it's like actions only, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
And so by being consistent and providing value and showing up and showing that you're there for the long term, like with any kind of relationship group, that's how you win the game. And that's some of the things that people talk about is like, a common objection is like speed, and like, we need to deliver candidates fast. And it's just like, well, just view it as going into a new vertical.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to take 90 to 100 days, 120 days to sort of figure out who's who, where you need to be, start to build the relationships. It's going to take 2, 3, 4, 5 touches. It's a new vertical. Just like approach it like that and have the commitment of that, and not just, I checked a box and donated $100 and then I turned around and went back to what I was doing.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
longer term.
And like with recruiters, like, I think there's so much effort focused on sourcing, right? But I think you also have a lot of power, at least for those first touch points, in that screening process. Like, before you're handing folks off to hiring managers, you can create you have the power to create a great interview experience for those candidates. So they feel like they're excited about even going into the next step if they are moving on to the next step. And so that's a specific kind of skill that you can build, but also just thinking through, what does that process mean to treat every single person like a human being? And when you really just think about there's a human behind every single person, and we want to make sure that they feel seen, valued, and heard, then every person from a marginalized identity will come in, and then they also feel seen, valued, and heard. It just grows from there. But that's a really tangible tactic that recruiters can take. But if they can't fix the entire process, they can at least fix that first touch point.
And as like recruiters, we all know the on-site interview is everything. Like that, you do not want to go in there, like get to that point and have something fall off that was like crap, because then as a recruiter, 70% of your work is start over now. And it's like with anything, we want to be the right, like, the right of first refusal. Like we want the candidate for sure to say yes, and then we decide whether they're going to be the right ones for us. You don't want candidates that you somehow turn off, but then ultimately you want to hire them and they've already said no to you. So like doing all the things that you can as a recruiter to make sure that that candidate is a yes. And then you have to sort of, see how the rest plays out. But being intentional about what you're in control of helps you set that up for success.
One of the things that we do at InterviewIA, because we closed our seed round, so now we're hiring, and we used our platform to actually bring our first 2 hires on board. And one of the things that we've done that most, whenever I talk to folks in hiring and recruiting, they kind of get a little blanched when I say this. It's like, give the candidates the questions before they come to the interview. And most people are like, wait, why would they do that? That's like a version of cheating. And, what I say is like, no, not everyone is the ability to just kind of riff on the spot. And 95% of jobs don't need the skill of riffing on the spot. Most jobs are like, you have different ways of thinking. And so yet by not giving a candidate questions, you're not really giving them an opportunity to present their best self. So what we did was we actually gave our candidates the questions in advance. And one of the things that happened was that it shaved off interviewing time. So interviews that typically took 30 minutes, like went down to 20 minutes, because the candidates were prepared to answer the question and they had time to be thoughtful about it. I was actually, when I first suggested this to the InterviewIA team, I was thinking about it from the perspective of neurodiversity. Actually, I was thinking, people who are, on the autism spectrum, or who may have a lot of anxiety, they're not going to be able to present their best selves with like a question that shows up and they don't have time to think about it. But like they could be incredible at the job that you're trying to hire them for. So give them the questions in advance and try and even out the playing field. And it worked, because honestly, like candidates came really well prepared and they could talk about examples from their past work that would be directly applicable to, and like that's where the transferable skills come to play. Like they can find those transferable skill opportunity and convey that to you in a way that's really meaningful. And that they'll be able to bring that. But like if you just ask them something on the spot and they didn't know the answer, the question right then and there, you missed out on an opportunity, an amazing candidate. And also the candidates loved that. They felt really appreciated that like there was transparency involved. Transparency is a really big key to building equitable processes. And when you're stop hiding things behind, unnecessarily hiding information or hiding things, people feel a lot more welcome into that space. And so that was another huge thing. So it was kind of like, while I was suggesting this to the team from a place of like, neurodiversity exists, let's allow everyone to bring their best selves, the hidden benefits were that every interviewer became more prepared, gave better answers, and shaved off a bunch of time in the interviewing process. And when you're interviewing literally like 80 people in like a week or less than that, shaving off 20 minutes from every interview makes a really big, or shaving off 10 minutes from every interview really adds up. And so that's just one example of something that you can do that makes a pretty big difference.
That is awesome. And I mean, Google has all of their tech interviews on YouTube now. So, I mean, it's like becoming a thing that the gotchas is a thing of the past. And it's like, wouldn't you want to assess someone's ability to do homework and deliver on goals? Like,
right.
And that's the thing is like disproportionately extroverts get hired more. That doesn't mean they're better at the job. It means they know how to talk. I like how you're saying like ability to riff and,
right. And like, if that's an important job skill you want people to have, then do that, but most jobs are not about that. So there's really no point in building an interview around that.
Right. What else can you speak to in terms of what recruiters can do, whether it's on the sourcing side or the interview prep? What else has been proving fruitful for the things that you all have been implementing?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it too is really sitting down with the hiring managers and thinking through what are the questions you need. That's part of what the InterviewIA process actually helps you do. We actually have a question bank full of questions that, like, we have a neuroscientist on team who actually has helped us figure out the ways to mitigate bias in the questions themselves. And so when the recruiters are working with the hiring managers, because like leveraging that ability to say, what are we really looking for? Because again, we tend to just default to magic numbers and default to like certain degrees, like the CS degree. When really, if you start having a conversation about like, what are the skills they need, what are the abilities they need, what is the alignment that they need? So the hiring manager has to reflect on like, what is that team culture? What is it that it currently exists, but also where's the culture at? Where do we want to be? And what are those things that we're looking for to be that culture at? And then the growth. Most hiring managers aren't thinking about that when they're talking about this stuff. But when you as a recruiter are going to them and giving them a framework to talk about it in a really different way, you are empowered to have more information to then approach this candidate pool in a totally different way. And I think that a lot of people, when you start being transparent about those stuff too, you'll end up getting a lot more candidates who are excited about working with your company because like they see that you're approaching this in a way that isn't about magic numbers and stuff like that.
And that's such a good thing that you're pointing out also about the hiring managers, because they're not the talent specialists. They are the one with the need. They need someone fast. They're just, they're doing their job.
Right.
And like, I honestly think that there's no bigger compliment to a recruiter than a hiring manager saying, that's a good question. I hadn't thought about that yet. And it's like, no problem. That's why I'm here, is to help you think through these things. And like going from some ephemeral, what makes a yes, to being like, no, really, what makes a yes? Like, so that we can also avoid the moving goalposts at the interview stage. And I'm also, it makes me think too, like, do you advise or coach in any way the conversation around, hey, let's take a minute and actually just talk about your team? Like, of the 8 people, how many people have CS degrees? How many people have boot camp degrees? How many are 20 something, 30 something? Do you guys talk a little bit about that in any way to guide the hiring managers to be like, what's your inventory now? And then we can identify the gaps so that we have a team that reflects the
We don't do that right now, but that's a good idea.
Yeah.
I think that's actually a really, like, there are definitely like, because I think with every company, it's a little bit different, right? Like with some companies, I've heard that recruiters basically send hiring managers a spreadsheet and they fill it out and then hand it back. And then the recruiters are out kind of just doing it based off of spreadsheet stuff. What I'm advocating for is conversations, which is really around like helping guide them through a conversation to get, I mean, you can still have a spreadsheet at the end of the day that outlines the ideas around abilities, alignment, and growth, around the intents behind every question. But the conversation is what's going to really spark the creative thinking that changes how you think about it. Yeah. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea, like doing a little bit of, how can you help people have those conversations as well? How can you help do that analysis? And I think, one of the questions when you're thinking about alignment is like, what is the current culture? Based on things like the CS degrees, or did everyone work at a Google, Amazon, Apple prior to this? But also thinking about where do you want to go? And I think that's also a really important question to ask, because just because the team's a certain way at this moment doesn't mean that's what you want it to be. So you can say, we're looking for people who can add this value to our team, who, really, we are very insular and we need someone who can help bring in new perspectives. Let's figure out how we can do that, how we can find someone who can bring those perspectives. And maybe they're going to have to be a little bit more bullish on bringing those perspectives, or maybe we want someone who's a great kind of harmonizer. And like that harmony is really what we're looking for, someone who can come into this team, bring new perspectives, but also be harmony driven. Like that's the kinds of questions that you need to start asking the hiring manager to start figuring out what does that next hire look like, and how can they be successful within the context of the team right now?
And then you bring up a good point there. And I think that's where that alignment comes in, is it's like, it's not just the skills and the tasks and the deliverables. It's like collaboration and, is 80% of your team extroverts? Then maybe you need to balance that as well. It's not just the skills or the background. It's also like the personality styles and that sort of thing. And I do love that we are more and more talking about culture add away from culture fit, because culture fit is just code with like, can I have a beer with you? And do you remind me of me?
Right. Exactly. That's exactly like, it just perpetuates that insularness. Like, that's why the industry is still white, like largely white men, because we feel comfortable with people who look like us and act like us and think like us.
Right.
And then there's no one challenging you to actually think more creatively and think more innovatively.
Well, and that just makes me think of a great conversation from a Recruiting Futures podcast. He had a gentleman on who had written a book about like high performing teams and just like analyzing what makes a high performing team. And one of the examples he gave was a study they did with economic forecasters, because you could actually measure their outcome. And they took like the top 25 economic forecasters in the world, looked at their models, and the person that was the most accurate, their forecasts were 5% more accurate than like the sum of the group, right? But when they took the top 6 forecasters, combined their forecast models, and then looked at it with the outcome, the combined top 6 was 15% more accurate than even the single most accurate person. And so basically the conclusion was homogeneous thinking is dangerous in complex environments. Because if you come from the same background, you have the same experiences, you have the same mental model of how things work. And as a human, we can only look 180. You know what I mean? And so it's like, if all of your team has the same background, you literally can only see 180 of the horizon. And you have all of this exposed to competitors and other things. Whereas if you have a mix of people that cover the bases, you're going to have a more innovative team. And I think thankfully, like diversity delivers results. Like, let's stop talking about the business case.
Right,
like
exactly.
Literally innovation requires different views. And so sort of framing it like that, I feel like hiring managers are getting it a little bit of like at an aggregate level and not just like a personal, like I have to do something different. It's like, oh, I'm actually leaving money on the table or innovation on the table because my team all is looking in the same direction.
Absolutely. There's this great documentary called Coded Bias that I'd recommend.
Netflix.
Yeah, is it on Netflix now?
It's on Netflix now. Yep, it's on my watch list for this weekend.
It's so good, because I think this shows you exactly what happens when you aren't thinking about diversity in recruiting. Just a couple examples just of when there's a lack of diversity in team. Like when Google started doing their facial recognition software, it was thinking that Black people, it was identifying them as apes, as gorillas. And like, that's really, I don't have to explain why that's problematic, but that was one of the things. It's like, if there was any kind of diversity on the team, they would have recognized we need to add more Black faces into our facial recognition data sources, so things like that don't happen. And, another example is that like Apple has this health tracker.
Oh, my favorite example.
And it's like they were tracking selenium and like copper intake, but it wasn't until iOS 9 that they finally started doing a period tracker. And it's like, these are kind of no duh questions, but if you just have a bunch of homogenous white males usually in the same room, you're missing out on these opportunities. And so, it's really important for us to think about it, because it's not just like opportunities, like there's also some really harmful things that can happen with this if you don't have those diverse,
right. Or even just, or even like your experience on a social media platform. And like, clearly people building the platforms have never been on the receiving end of like hardcore trolling or, violence or things like that, because they would have built in safety measures. Because similar is like, even just small things that your address has to be posted if you're a business owner. It's like, why would I need my personal address? Like, there's just things where it's like, if you've never been on the receiving end of discrimination, bias, systemic violence, you don't even have that thought, let alone like build for it. And so, it's just harm is done. And the Apple thing is that's why I like put innovative in quotes, like Apple so innovative.
Right.
Menstruation tracker, 50% of the world's population on a monthly basis for decades of their life. Whoops, forgot about it. It's just
right. Exactly.
Yeah.
We have a couple questions coming.
I was just going to say, we have
Yeah.
a few questions. Okay, this one's coming from Sam Reed, and this is a really good one. Is there a need? What do you think about creating more of like a hybrid version interview process? We did touch on this a little bit, that requires maybe, being able to be prepared and show plans, but then also managing some surprise questions. Have you seen that in action? Any thoughts on how to do that? This is also especially probably like sales, account management, recruiters, or a high stress situation where you have to just deal with what inputs you have. What would you decide?
Yeah, and I think the key is transparency and setting up expectations for the candidate, right? So, for example, if you know that there's going to be some kind of on your feet question thinking, then just say like, hey, we're going to ask these questions, but just so you know, we're going to ask you a couple questions that are meant to help us understand your on your feet thinking. But that way there's still an expectation, like they're still going to have to do the on your feet thinking questions. But if you set the expectation, like, here's the questions we can prep you with, but just so you know, we have an intent to understand these things from you. So this is what's going to happen in the interview too. That's still transparency, and it's still being clear about what you're measuring. So that's like a great way for a recruiter to kind of set up expectations so people feel like they know what to prepare for and how to prepare it. And if it's just like, be ready to be surprised by some questions on, we want to measure your on your feet thinking, then they know this is to be measured by on my feet thinking.
Yes. And I love what you added there in terms of be clear on what they're measuring. Like, I can't tell you the questions, but we're looking for adaptability. We're looking for, if you're a salesperson, like the ability to do some math, right? Calculations real quick on commissions, what have you. Sort of like you can give a theme. And like that already is going to help a candidate be like, okay, I'm prepared to be put on my feet. Is different than being like, whoa, I'm put on my feet, I love that. The transparency thing has just been a real theme, and that's awesome.
Yeah, it makes people, that's one of the things that we learned about the process, is that people feel good about transparency. They just really love it.
Yeah.
And being really honest. I think one of the things that we also have done when we send out our rejection letters, which is, obviously a really hard thing to do, is we tell them it's not a no, it's a not now. Because you never really know where people's journeys will take them. Like, they might not be the right person for the right job for this specific need of our company at this point, but 4 years from now, they might have developed a whole different set of skill sets. And, their alignment could be at the right place at the right time in their life that works with our company at that point. So, I think it's about not burning bridges too, and recognizing that we all have our own pathways and we are all going to go in different directions. And it could be that our paths line up again, or it could be that they don't, but, recognizing that we're all going to be growing in different ways. So just because it's a no doesn't mean that it's like a no forever. It's just a not now.
Right. Yep. And it's timing and the right match, but you have to have the timing too, for sure. And then we have another question kind of following up on the interview process in terms of how can the organization and recruiters ensure that candidates are actually skilled and knowledgeable with what they're saying in the interview? Have you been able to kind of crack that nut a little bit?
Yeah, for us, I think it's really about providing examples. And being really clear about providing examples. And that's where we tend to go, where it's like we give them the context for what we're looking for, and then providing an example of like where they've used a skill, a transferable skill, usually from one place to another. And I think that when you're asking for specific examples, that tends to get away from the BS ones. The people who are going to BS you, they're going to BS you. There's nothing you can do about that, but you're able to get to the core when people are able to like pull out stories from their life that shows that they can do what that you need them to do. If they have that skills and have experience with that.
And then as the interviewer, you ask some follow-up questions just to make sure the story has the full depth.
Yep, exactly. The follow-up questions are also really key.
That is awesome. Okay. feel free to keep your questions coming, everyone. We've got about 10 minutes left. And I know, Nina, we had talked about you obviously already shared so much wisdom and things for us to keep learning about. Have you had thoughts on like any tips or suggestions that you think words of wisdom you would like to share with our group today?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have anything new, but I think the one thing is to kind of beat the drum. Like the more you keep on talking about the value of doing this, and the way you show up and do it, like it starts to permeate with the people around you and they start internalizing that. Two, just think about the behavioral change you can make, and how you're conducting your interviews and how you're going about recruiting and building relationships and who you're building relationships, when you're talking about sourcing. And then three, I think, is really about like having those conversations to rethink how you are building those job descriptions and how you're thinking about how we're designing what we're looking for. And so when you are proposing these kinds of new ways of addressing it, then that organizational change can start happening too.
Speaking of this, here's one more question. I love that. So we have a question from Bedelia. With our new virtual environment, how have you pivoted to building relationships virtually?
Yeah, that's a good question.
That's a really good question.
Yeah, I don't have a direct answer based on a lot of experience, but what I have noticed about virtual communities is that in a way, COVID has opened up the doors for us to expand our recruiting efforts across the country. And especially for a lot of companies who are now doing remote first or at least remote optional. Because now when you were very geographically based, like when I first moved to Colorado, it was hard to get a lot of diversity in companies because there wasn't a lot of people of color here. So in order to do it, you really had to convince people to move here. And that's challenging in its own way because they move here and then they felt like me, where it's just like, I don't have a place where I belong here. So, a lot of times they would leave. But now with this remote first environment, you can start recruiting from all of these different parts of the country where people can feel comfortable in their own homes. And then also we need to create that environment at work, that virtual work, where people can feel comfortable too. So I think part of it is when you're building relations. So that's one element of it. But like to answer your question directly about building relationships in a virtual environment, it comes down to the same kind of tactics you would use in a kind of physical environment. You reach out and you offer things of value to these communities. When you're kind of saying like, I can help, with funding this group, or I can help with, instead of saying like, I'll fund the food for this, like you can think of other creative ways to like provide resources to these groups. And then the other thing that you can do is like, even if it isn't monetary resources, bringing experts to the table, like tell them that you bring your own network into the table and say, we can offer these speakers, or we can offer these webinars, or we can offer this type of content to these folks, or these types of connections. When you offer something of value to a group, then that's how those relationships start building. And so it doesn't change with a virtual environment. It just changes, maybe like going from providing food to providing something else.
Yeah, I'm a big advocate for offering to do resume writing webinars, interview prep webinars. Like inherently, we can do that. And that's not only delivering value to help folks from these groups get ready for these jobs and interviewing for the jobs, so hopefully they get the jobs, but then you're also directly connecting with the talent that is going to be looking for the work, and you're building a relationship and you're standing out. Yeah, I feel like financial is important because we have the access, so we should do that. But the real value is like helping folks get the jobs. And
yeah. Actually, one of the things I've seen recruiters do is they'll set up they'll put an hour block of 5-10 minute increments, and they'll just put the calendar out, and like people can sign up for 5-10 minute increments for a resume review. So they literally get that one-on-one time with someone and to actually look at their resume, and that's just an hour out of your day, but you're still offering that to a whole community. It'll be first come, first serve, but still that's a high value thing you can offer that would be really meaningful.
Oh, totally. Like almost like an office hours, Thursdays from 3 to 4, my office hours. I am here for anything you want to talk about, even negotiations, salary negotiations. As recruiters, and if we're, in the market, we know what base level salaries are. And it's like, do not even start below this. That's where when you're sort of an isolated group, you don't get the regular information. And so it's like, you also have the ability as a recruiter to have the insider information, and don't start below 70, make 70 your bottom. I know that's already a lot for you, or if it is, right?
Yeah.
So
that's a really good point. That's a really great way to bring more diversity into the industry too, because you're evening out the playing field by reaching out to marginalized groups who would never recognize what they can bring to the table, and you are telling them exactly, like, you are finding those things that they can bring to the table, so now they can be better advocates for themselves too.
Information is power. And so the more that we can empower our candidates and our communities about money, I think we should talk about money more often, but like interviews and skills, and the more the merrier across the board. How can people stay connected with you, Nina? What are some ways they can engage with you moving forward?
Absolutely. So anyone can interview me, or not interview, email me at nina@interviewiA.com. I'm always happy to hop on a call and chat. They can also follow me on Twitter. It's just at Nina Baliga. And yeah, that's probably the best way to get in touch with me.
And the Choose Inclusion podcast.
Right. And the Choose Inclusion podcast. So if you go to chooseinclusion.com, we're putting out content every single week from, we've had CEOs, HR directors, we've had professional Paralympic athletes, we've had chefs, we've had activists, we've had all kinds of people come onto the podcast and share views. And so that's also another great way to kind of learn and grow, is by going to chooseinclusion.com podcast. And from there, you'll figure out what podcast platform you are most comfortable using to listen to.
Yeah. And if anyone is in an organization that is being intentional about their interview process, do check out InterviewIA. It's a very sophisticated platform. And it not only trains and enables the recruiters, but I would say almost more importantly, the hiring teams, because, everything's a ripple effect. And so I have more and more people asking about how do we train our interview teams, and it's built in with what the platform does and the mission of it. So congratulations on the close of that fund. I mean, that round is amazing. It's so inspiring to see this happening right here in Denver, and keep up the great work. Thanks so much for your time today, Nina.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Yes. And for those who are interested in learning more about our talent grant, you can go to recruitinginnovation.com, click the grant button at the top of the website, and learn more about our Ernestine McClendon talent grant and become part of the change that we're bringing into the tech recruiting industry. Once again, I'm Allison Daly, founder of Recruiting Innovation, and thanks for joining us on the leadership series with our guest, Nina Baliga. Thanks, Nina.
Take care, everyone.
Well, until next time, everybody. Bye.